Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here. Well, we're going to talk now about this challenge, the populist challenge. Welcome, 2016. What a year, right? We had in Europe the Brexit, the referendum in Italy, and of course in the United States of America the elections with this result. No one was really expecting. What a year. The traditional parties are definitely losing influence, and there are new parties, new populist leaders who are getting into power. Especially in the Western world, we can see a revolt against the elites. But what does this mean? What is expecting us next year? I already told you what we saw this year. What is going to happen next year? That's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about a challenge with my excellent panelists. Please let me introduce you to Jorge Castañeda. You probably know him. He was Secretary of Foreign Affairs from the year 2000 till 2003 under the administration of Vicente Fox in Mexico, and he's now Professor for Politics and Latin American Studies at New York University. Next to him, Fuad Maksumi. He comes from the private energy sector and is Secretary General in the National Dialogue Forum in Lebanon, as well as chief of an energy company. Sorry. And next to him, Miguel Ángel Moratinos. He was Minister of Foreign Affairs in Spain under Prime Minister José Luis Zapatero from the year 2004 until 2010. And during that time, he was responsible for the withdrawal of Spanish troops from Iraq. Sitting next to him, Yasha Monk, lecturer at Harvard University, fellow at the Transatlantic Academy, and recently he has been publishing about what we're going to talk today about the crisis of liberal democracies. Please welcome them.
Thank you.
Well, I would like to start talking about one man, a man that everyone is talking about, especially at these kind of gatherings. You probably know who I'm talking about, Donald Trump. Donald Trump, the president-elect of the United States, he said a lot of controversial things during his campaign. The question is, are these only promises, or do we have to take them seriously? Mr. Castañeda, what would you say?
Well, I would begin, Carolina, by saying that the populist phenomenon is something that we are very familiar with in Latin America. We have been going through different stages of populist leaders, at least since the 1930s, and as recently as 3 or 4 years ago. And so this notion that at some point certain parts of the people, as Hubert Védrine was saying yesterday, rise up against the elites, we've been living through this now for almost a century in Latin America, and we're familiar with it. Before answering your question directly, I'd like to bring up a case, one of the recent cases in Latin America, which might be enlightening to determine what happens with Trump. When Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999 in Venezuela, the first year and a half of his term, the Clinton administration was still in office, and they had a very competent ambassador in Caracas, John Maisto. And John was constantly repeated for those 2 years, don't pay attention to what Chavez says, just look at what he does, which is very intelligent. Except it then turned out that he ended up doing what he said, almost to the letter. Now, not because he was a especially consistent or honest politician, but because he had to respond to that very direct link that he established with the people, le peuple, les peuples, as Védrine said. When you have that direct link, you have to end up doing most of what you promised, because you promised things that people want from you. And I think this is what will, in general terms, occur with Trump. He played to his constituencies. He understood very well, as several people said last night, what they wanted, and now he has to deliver. Does he have to deliver everything to everybody overnight? No. Does he have to deliver something to some people some of the time? Yes. And I think it would be better to stop being in denial and place Trump in the context of other populist leaders and movements, not just the last 3 months, but the last 100 years almost.
Mr. Castaneda, so you're trying to tell us that we have to get prepared for the worst case scenario?
I think to always expect the worst and hope for the best.
Okay. Okay. Well, the worst can be the best for some, Mr. Makhzoumi. Trump also referred to climate change. He's not really a fan of climate change policies. Are these maybe good news for the energy sector you're in?
Absolutely. I think we need a change. What we have seen so far is that the traditional politicians, they like to stick to history. Because as long as they are in the cocoon of history, they can justify staying in power. What we've seen in the United States is the first time that the people are saying enough is enough with the traditional politics that basically got us nowhere. If I want to take it a little bit to the Middle East where I come from, Donald Trump, I think, will be good for us. Forget about all of these negative statements about Islam and all of this. At the end of the day, he's a transactional president, so he's going to be dealing with reality. And the reality, at least we have now a president that he has declared what he wants to do, as you rightly said. And the question is up to us now to find ways to try to find common denominators with him, rather than to keep challenging him. Because the past 8 years, we've been given that we love you, Middle Easterns, but at the end of the day, when the time got very tough, we saw an agreement with Iran, and the other side is waiting in the dark. So I believe his statements, I agree with the minister, let's give him the chance, but it is up to us, because we cannot afford to be enemies to the United States. We have to find ways to cooperate with the United States. And the sooner we can get this process started, the sooner we can all live happily and try to capitalize on what the US stands for.
Cooperate with the United States in the sense of policies or business?
Both, because at the end of the day, the United States, they justify, they want to do business, they want to control things, but from them, they will go from the door of freedom, democracy, and changes of policy. So what we need to do is that to try to find common grounds with them. Otherwise, they have the destruction power, which we don't. And at the end of the day, we have to deal with realities. And the realities is that they have one standard, all of us, we have a different standard. And the question, how we can find a way to minimize the gap in order that we find common grounds with them.
The gap, is this the reason for people to vote for the populist leaders? I would like to know your answer, Mr. Monk. But before we start with that, I would like to open a word cloud, so please vote. Give me a word. Why should people vote for a populist leader? While we see these nice words growing, please, Mr. Monk, what would you say? How would you explain the success of populist leaders we're witnessing right now?
Yeah, I think, but before we get to the causes of this populist rise, I think it's worth thinking for a moment about what it actually means. I think Jorge Castaneda has started in a good way by saying that we need to take seriously what populists say. That in many countries where they've promised extreme things, and the political class has assumed, oh, well, nothing extreme is going to happen, pretty extreme things happened. Venezuela is a great example, but there's many others, from Poland to Hungary to Russia to Turkey and beyond. And I've been struck for the last 3 days by the fact that 90% of our discussions could have taken place exactly the same way 2-3 years ago. And 10% of our discussion here, insofar as it was about Donald Trump, was mostly of a form of saying, let's wait to see what happens, I'm sure it'll all be fine. And I don't think that. I think that the liberal Western order is under existential threat at this point. I think that the liberal order in the United States is under existential threat at this point. And if we continue acting as though nothing were going on, we're going to see that nice little conferences like this one here in Marrakesh are going to look pretty different 5 years from now. We're going to be talking about pretty different things, but they'll be a lot less inclusive. But the world order is going to be a lot less stable.
What is missing? Which are the reasons for this crisis of liberal democracies?
So what we're seeing is a big turn away of people from liberal democracy, that when you look at public opinion polls across North America and Western Europe, people have actually fallen out of love with liberal democracy in important ways. That they're less invested in living in a democracy, that they're more open to straightforward authoritarian alternatives to democracy, and that you see the rise of these anti-system parties and movements who really flout basic parts of democratic norms. And I think there's 3 reasons for this. One is a big increase in economic anxiety. All through the history of stable liberal democracies in North America and Western Europe, you've seen a very rapid increase in the living standards of people from one generation to the next. So just to give an example, in the United States, from 1930 to 1955, the standard of living of an average American doubles. From 1955 to 1980, it doubles again. Well, since then, it's essentially remained stagnant. That's a very big change. We've never been in that situation before. We've never had liberal democracies be stable without that kind of increase in the standard of living. The second reason has to do with identity. And many countries, many democracies have been founded as mono-ethnic, monocultural countries, in which they thought that everybody who's part of a nation descends more or less from the same people. And now you see these nations having to change the idea of who really belongs, of who is a part of it. And that's a very difficult process. We don't know that it can be done. It's in some ways a unique historical experiment. And even in countries like the United States or Canada, that have always been countries of immigration, there has always been a clear racial hierarchy. And that's being challenged now. So people in those countries, who are part of the majority, have to start to accept that people who don't look like them, who come from very different parts of the world, are truly their equals. That the president may be black, that the boss may be Latino, and some of them don't like that. And so those are two very fundamental challenges. Thinking about how liberal democracy can survive in a time when average people are no longer having that increase in the standard of living, and thinking about how countries that are founded as mono-ethnic, monocultural, can actually make a real transition to being multi-ethnic democracies. And it's worth fighting for this. And it's possible that we'll win this fight. But we're now in a struggle for the survival of what these countries look like.
We can also see this in the cloud, inequality, frustration, ignorance. Will you also see that as the lack of education as one of the reasons?
Certainly, I think, I don't think ignorance is a very helpful term, just as it wasn't very helpful for Hillary Clinton to talk about a basket of deplorables. But I think what is true is that people have in some ways started to take democracy and democratic norms for granted. That there's a reason why young people, actually, in all of these polls, give less importance to living in a democracy than older people. So, for example, looking at the United States, when you look at people who were born in the 1930s and 1940s, over two-thirds say it's essential to me to live in a democracy, 10 out of 10. Once you get to millennials, born since 1980, less than one-third say the same. Millennials in the United States are also more open than older people to extreme alternatives to democracy like army rule. Now, why is that? I think a lot of this is that young people take their freedoms for granted, focus on the things that are bad about the system without seeing what's good in it, don't have the experience that their parents or grandparents had of fighting against fascism or communism, of being able to imagine what those alternatives are like. And so I think part of what we have to do, and part of our job as effectively members of a political elite, is to try and communicate what in our system is worth saving, what's dangerous about other systems, but also to reform our systems to make sure that people have a feeling that we're on their side again. Because if it's going to be a fight between a set of politicians who look like they're doing business as usual and they're just comfortable, they're having a lovely time in Marrakesh, and they're not really standing up for people, and when other people who look like they're on the side of ordinary people, no matter how ineffective their solutions, no matter how hateful some of their rhetoric, they're going to win every time.
Well, let's get a bit more concrete. Mr. Moratinos, you're a member of the PSOE, the Socialist Party in Spain, and also in Spain you can see a rise of populist movements. What is your party concretely doing to get closer to the concerns of people in Spain?
Well, I think if we look at the screen, we can find, for me, the two main concepts that produce and feed up, populism. Number one, inequality. Inequality has been discussed, and during the two sessions of yesterday, a day before yesterday, it came very often. And then, it's not put like that, but our colleague has mentioned, is identity. That's in internal manner. And if we refer identity and inequality that, mutually interactive, as you are taking benefit of the economic and social development, you look around and you see the people who are working and maybe taking your job out. So you go to the international affairs and then you see the consequences of globalization, this genuine globalization, and then emigration. So the four elements in internal space is equality and identity, and then globalization and emigration. But if we go to the root causes of what is the bridge between the elite or the political class and the social fabrics, is something that maybe we are surprised with. But we should not be so much surprised. They are the consequences of the lack of politics. We have a Fuad. We will have a good discussion today. And we are trying to manage the world. Globalization, we have to be efficient. We have to be a startup. We have to produce more goods. We have to grow. But there is no political guidance in order to really feed, the brains, the mentality of the people with some direction. So the people, as we are creating a society that we need consumers, we are not building citizens. We want people to consume, and you consume everything, even the political leaders. You consume, they present you a new list, and you consume it, because what you have been trying is not good. And you have lost, after the Berlin Wall, there is no ideological struggle. There is no ideological fight for ideas. So political parties, as Jorge has said, and others, has been, absolutely out of the box, out of the analysis. Social Democrats, for instance, we should have been the one to really be the star. After the fall of Berlin Wall, the end of history, market economy, neoliberalism. Okay, then Lehman Brothers, the collapse of capitalism. So in the middle, social democracy should be the one to answer.
But what kind of answers? I mean, what concrete? What will you do? Talk to the citizens?
The kind of answer is
dialogue?
just to have a political narrative that is adapting to the new technology, the new ways of production, and to make the people participate. That the old politics party are not prepared for the new world. Economic decisions are taken in a second, and political decisions take 2 months or 3 months through different procedure. And as our friends say, the democratic representative system is totally at the last chapter of its history. We have to renew it, and we have to think about how we enhance our democratic system.
Mr. Castañeda, we already agreed on the root causes of this populism. What would you see as a solution for that?
Well, I don't know if it's a solution, but I think that many of these movements, as I said, going back to 100 years in Latin America and very recently in the rest of the world, tend to have been predictable and actually were predicted. Why? Because in a series of cases you had untenable situations. And those untenable situations lead to crises. So if you don't do something about an untenable situation, you will have that crisis. And I'll give you 2 examples, again, one in Venezuela and one in the United States. In the case of Venezuela, the levels of corruption of the so-called Punto Fijo Pact between 1959 and 1999 were just incredible, even by Latin American standards. I mean, we in Mexico, we know about corruption. We generally, in the Olympic Games of corruption, we get bronze medal, silver medal, many of the times gold medals. We are really... But what the Venezuelans did during those 40 years is something absolutely incredible. Well, when you have that, you are going to have a reaction. And you had the reaction, which was Hugo Chavez. In the United States, many of us have been saying, one, the immigration situation from the year 1995 onward, at least through 2012 or 13, was becoming overwhelming. Today there are more foreign-born people, many Mexicans of course, in the United States than any time since 1913. That's 1 century. A large number of them are in places where Americans have never seen a Mexican. Mexicans are strange to them. They eat strange foods. They have a strange religion. Mexicans play with a round ball, okay? Americans in Ohio play with a long ball, okay? They don't understand.
An egg.
They have no idea.
As an immigrant to the United States, I always thought that American football should be called hand egg.
Right.
It's not played by feet or football, but anyway.
It's both. So it's ridiculous. It's not handball, it's not football, it's both. So the Americans, they look at this, who are these guys? And they sing strange songs. They dance strange ways. I mean, they're very strange people, these Mexicans. And so the Americans, these Americans who are not from New York, not from Texas, not from California, but they're from Pennsylvania, from Iowa, from Nebraska, they go crazy. If you keep allowing this to happen, it becomes untenable, and you have a reaction. Obviously, that did not mean stop immigration. It meant legalize, regularize, regulate immigration in a way that makes it more acceptable, more cohabitable for most Americans. That did not happen in the United States. Another quick example, trade.
But you also have, Latinos voting for Donald Trump. I mean, immigrants looking
of course,
weird to other
those are the
immigrants.
Latinos, Carolina, who are Mexican American, largely, second or third or fourth generation. And they say, look, these new guys are also going to take away some of the privileges I have, because I have been here for 50, 60 years. But just a final very quick example on trade, because it's something we've been talking about here. People have been saying in the United States, intelligent, sophisticated economists, politicians, since 94 more or less, with NAFTA, and then with China entering WTO. If you do not mitigate the impact of globalization on what last night someone called the white working class, which by the way can also be the Latino and black working class. If you do not mitigate those circumstances, these people will get angry because they are suffering. You have to mitigate it. You have to mitigate it with education, professional training, unemployment insurance at higher levels. A lot of things which the Americans did not do over the past 20 years. So now what do you have? Now you have the white working class who got angry. But it's very logical that they got angry. We have these people at the Carrier air conditioning plant in Indiana. They make $25, $26, $27 an hour. They fire them. They lay them off. They take the jobs to Mexico. And what happens with them? They can get a new job as a nurse making $14 an hour. So you imagine, Carolina, if tomorrow Deutsche Welle says, Carolina, you're doing a wonderful job. We're going to pay you half of what you make. But you're going to applaud?
Of course not. Mr. Moratinos, is this what is happening in Europe?
Absolutely. Well, yesterday news is one of the examples how we can support populism with the Greece situation. A country with difficulties, has not been very much on the line of the criteria and the responsibility of the financial effort of everybody. But once they agree, this so-called elite, this so-called bureaucrat, this so-called Brussels, decide that, the Prime Minister cannot give and increase the pension of poor people or give some more support to the islands that are, receiving the effort of refugees. So how can in Greece people will react with this austerity policy? What has happened in Spain, the case of Podemos, it was because the austerity policy. I mean, we all are very happy to have economic reform. Okay. We have to streamline our budget. Okay. We have to take care of the welfare state. Okay. But we should be able to decide by the people who are the sacrifices that we have to do. And that's, I think, what the Europeans yesterday, we have a interesting panel about Europe, and then democratization. Yes, people have to be much more involved, But in not only in the political institution, but in the economic decision, who are this troika? Who are, the people who decide that they have to be investing in social affairs and cutting, the health system? No, that has to be discussed. Maybe at the end, everybody agree that we have to make an effort in education system, but at least people have to take part. Why we have to reduce 0.3 point of deficit?
Mr.
There
Mann,
has been no control of the economic decision taken by Brussels. And so that is what is creating in Spain, Podemos, in Greece was, Tsipras movement, and in the rest of the world, because people don't feel that they can't go ahead.
So I agree with everything you said until that last thing in the rest of the world, which is to say that I think that austerity in the south of Europe especially has been a problem. And that, as somebody who grew up in Germany, I think one of the greatest failings of the current German government and of Angela Merkel, who in other ways is now being stylized as a new leader of a free world, has been to actually accelerate the rise of these populists in southern Europe through an austerity policy that doesn't really work. But I think it's too easy to say, oh, it's austerity politics that leads to this populist rise. If we didn't have austerity politics, everything would be fine. Because look around at some of the countries that haven't had strong austerity policies. And some of the countries of the economy has actually been doing pretty well since the crisis.
But
look at Sweden, look at Germany, look at the United States, which had a huge stimulus after 2008. So in these countries, you still have a rise of populists. So it's too easy to say, you know what, it was the austerity policy of the euro that leads to the rise of populism. The austerity policy in the euro leads the populism in southern Europe to take the particular form it did with Syriza and Podemos and Cinque Stelle in Italy, rather than something like the United States. But when you look around, even countries that didn't have austerity policies have had these problems. So I'm very, very wary in general of explanations. In whichever country I go to, people in that country give me an explanation that works for that country. People in Spain say, oh, it's the euro and austerity policy. People in the United States say, oh, it's hyper-partisanship and the fact that the parties are so far apart from each other. People in Germany say, oh, it's because Angela Merkel is such a centrist and there's no distinction between the parties. In each country, you get very different causal stories, and it doesn't work. We have to figure out why it is that this populist movement has happened in the United States and in Spain and in Sweden and in Germany and in Poland and in Hungary and in Turkey and in India. They're very, very different countries that are going through surprisingly similar developments. So we have to look for causes that are common to all of those countries.
We're talking about populism in a very negative way. But Mr. Makhzoumi, do you see it that way? You met a few weeks ago, you were telling me backstage, Mr. Putin and also Mr. François Fillon. Why didn't you meet Mrs. Marie Le Pen, for example?
Well, the opportunity didn't come up, but we'll wait till after the elections. I would like to address, it's nice to hear everything about Europe and the United States, but the main problems nowadays is the Middle East. That's where we have the problems. That's where the terrorism is there. Middle East today, or the MENA region, is 350 million people. The total GDP is 1.5 trillion. It means the average income per capita is $3,500. We are 40% exporter of the world energy, yet the income per capita is $3,500. With the media around, everybody in the Middle East has a phone. So basically information is available like 24 hours. When they see that we are exporting 40% of our energy and their standard of living is very bad, and when there was an attempt in the past to revolt, the issue of stability, as they call stability of the region, came up. People are saying enough is enough. Since most of our countries in the Middle East were given its independence after 1940, over the last 70 years, income per capita over these years went down. Most of the people are under the poverty line in the Middle East. And the question is that we wonder, in the Western world, why do we have extremists coming up there? The latest study by the UNHCR, it says 28% of the people are between the age of 15 and 28. 60% are under the age of 30. If you look at, until now, most of the involvement into political life, into public life, we barely have 22% of the people that actually go and vote. What does that mean? It means the young people are saying we are not connected to this establishment, to these countries. We don't believe we are partners in this, and we want the change. Unfortunately, the leaders in the Arab world, they only talk about history so that they can maintain the status quo and stay in power. What we need at this stage is to really engage the civil society. Because if these people are not given a chance, there is the alternative, which is fundamentalism movement and the Daesh movement, whereby they're telling them, you've tried it for 70 years, you failed, let me give you the alternative, and unfortunately that's where religions come in. So what we need to do is to really start thinking very seriously. The issue of immigration that we have been hearing for the last 2 days, it's not something that can go away if you pay money. Africa was half the population of Europe in 1950. By 2050, it will be 3 times. So the question is that, with no economical development, no prosperous life, no way that they can live, where do you expect them to go? So this is something that we cannot just ignore. We need to deal with it because otherwise we're all paying the price for it.
To refer to the citizens, what is the role of media, Mr. Monk? Do media have are responsible also for the success of the populists, or what will you say?
To figure out what the role of the media is, we have to understand what the nature of the attack on truth norms in our society is. There's been a lot of talk about that in the last months. The post-truth politics, post-factual politics, in German even post-faktisch end up being the word of the year, whatever that means. And I think the concepts we have for it are actually insufficient, they're too naive. So 2 of the concepts that have been used over the last years, one by Stephen Colbert, the TV comedian, who was talking about truthiness, things that may not be true, but they feel true. That's a helpful way of thinking about it, but I don't think it goes quite that far. The other term is a very technical term introduced by the Princeton philosopher Harry Frankfurt, who, in a bestseller on bullshit, defines bullshit as saying things when you're indifferent to the truth. You don't care about whether it's true or not. I think both of these actually step too short. When you look at what something like Vladimir Putin does in Russia, or for that matter, what somebody like Donald Trump may try to do and start to do over the next years, it's not just being indifferent to the truth. It's not just saying things because they feel true. It's actually trying to undermine our ability to transact politics on the basis of the truth at all. It is to introduce so many falsehoods into the political system, to lie so mendaciously, saying that the question of whether or not Russia hacked the election never came up, when it came up in the presidential debates on live television, in front of millions and millions of people. It is to confuse people so much, to put out so many conspiracy theories, that nobody can actually report out and remember all those facts. But even people who are pretty politically informed have to start taking the view of reality on trust from their political team, from the media outlets they trust, from the people they trust. Nobody can anymore really have a sense of what is going on. And that, I think, is a very deliberate attempt at undermining our ability to have rational political discourse. So what can the media do in response to that? Well, it's very difficult. You can, first of all, give up false truth norms, false norms of objectivity. So a lot of American media in particular always have this idea that on any story you have to give a view on one side and a view on the other side. So when somebody makes a claim that is blatantly false, you have to cite somebody who says, yes, I believe this claim, and cite somebody who says, no, this claim is wrong. And that, I think, is digging your own demise. As a media outlet, you have to be absolutely clear about the truth, absolutely clear about political norms, basic democratic norms, and not solicit the opinion of one person on each side.
Mr. sorry to interrupt you. What about the digital media? You don't have a control really on that, so you're talking about traditional media. And please, if you have questions, just start writing them. Or do we have microphones, please? 1 and 2. Mr. Monk, what about digital media?
Well, I think that's true. I mean, the New York Times now has many more views online than it does in print. So I don't think that this is separate for digital media than it is for print media. It's the same question of how you report. The problem, of course, is, and this is a problem that the digital space allows, that if CNN had done responsible journalism over the last year, which it didn't, then people probably would have turned in even greater numbers to Fox News or the Trump News Network, which we may still get over the next years. So the problem with digital media is not that what you should do is different. You should do exactly the same thing. You should insist on the truth and not have a false neutrality which undermines the truth. But one of the results is going to be that we'll have an even more polarized media system in which we have even greater echo chambers. And there's little we can do about that.
Before we go to the audience questions, Mr. Moratinos, you had a comment on that.
Well, I want to follow up on what he's been saying. Austerity, of course, is not the only cause. I mean, we are always making mistakes because we are still analyzing or trying to find a single reason for the election of Trump or how you succeed in the climate change summit. No, today community is different, and populism, one of the reasons I think is not only inequality, as you say, and everybody agree, there's austerity, it is also the new change in technology, in the way to communicate. People don't want to be represented by others. I mean, the great change and the end of political parties, because before political parties was the passerelle, you know, the traditional democracy in Greece, it was two elements, representation and participation. Okay, till the 20th century, we want to be represented, and then we vote for people to represent us. Today, people consider that they represent themselves. They can go to the social network. They can be the best expert on Syria conflict. They can decide who is good, who is bad. Even for the media are criticized. Media is not follow what happened in Trump election. The media was in favor of Hillary, and people don't care about media anymore. So people want to participate, to have their own saying, and that's the main concern about populism. So all these elements have to be taken together. The lack of social justice, economic justice, the lack of ideological platform, the new technology revolution, and that have to be a comfort in the new world. And if we don't work on that direction, well, we will have managers, and then elite, and then the people say, we don't vote. If you make a poll, today's world, to the whole international community, and you ask them, is the world round? Is the planet round? I will say that it will be at least 50% say no. Because
would that be like that? We can try that here.
They don't trust us.
Especially if you try holding a referendum on it.
So the people, that is the main concern about populism.
Mr. Castañeda, you wanted to add something on that?
2 points on this. One, I think we should all try to keep the conventional media's feet to the fire on the truth. But the problem is that you can go around the traditional media or the conventional media now through the social media. And everybody, as Moratino says quite accurately, can become the world's leading expert on the Syrian crisis and the evacuation from Aleppo. And you can have some nut in Mexico City saying, I have the solution to the problem in Aleppo. And he can actually end up having 1 million followers seeing his YouTube video or his tweet. The other point I would just like to add very quickly before we move on to the questions is, one lesson we have learned in Latin America from these populist movements, as I said, over a century now, they tend to hang around for a while. They do not disappear overnight. They find ways to stay in power. If you just look very quickly, Chavez and Maduro, 17 years. It's an incredibly lousy government. I mean, you do not have that many lousy governments in the world. They are now there for 17 years. Evo Morales, a better government, but still, 12 years. Rafael Correa in Ecuador, 10 years. The Kirchners in Argentina, it got out of control because Nestor Kirchner, the first one, he did something very stupid. He died. And then that got complicated because, once he was going to succeed the wife, he couldn't succeed the wife because he died. They tried to make him immortal, they couldn't manage it, so he left. But they would have continued for another 10, 12 years. Daniel Ortega was first elected president of Nicaragua in 1990. Many of the people here hadn't been born yet. This can go on and on and on. So the Europeans should be careful with this stuff. because you know how the guys get there. You don't know how and when they leave.
And so should we Americans.
Mr. Matsumi, you wanted to say something,
Yeah.
sorry, on media, and then we're going to your question. I'm sorry.
The one thing about social media, which we have to really appreciate, in Egypt, it started with the social media because they wanted to eat. It was a very simple message. We want to eat and we want to live. No democracy, no change of regime. And then it picked up. Tunis, Libya, Syria, everywhere is the same story. So I agree with the minister. The bottom line is that if we can encourage the civil society to actually be more engaged rather than to resign their role in society, change will happen. And then at that point, the politicians have to listen to them. In the Middle East, as you know, the only serious game changer is God. Because when he decides to get people out, for them to die, that will be basically we get change. Otherwise, we're stuck unless we can encourage the civil society to move.
Engagement and participation. Do you have a question on that, or is it on media?
My name is Jalal from Ethiopia. I'm just saying populism is not exclusive to Europe or Latin America. It's everywhere, Middle East, Africa, etc. Do you think this brand of populism, which somebody called it white nationalism, is going global? Will be international movement similar like Marxism in the 60s? Associated to this question is liberalism value in crisis? And we ignore that largely human society is very conservative and liberalism is in a deep crisis. And my last point is, are we going to see clash of culture? Like let's say.
We have one more question. It was here, there. Do you have a microphone?
Just a question about the responsibility of the elites. We can't, according to me, understand this populist movement without taking into account that there was huge failures in the elites in providing a project, a meaningful project. I'm referring to globalizations and financial deregulation in the United States where most of the costs were borne by the actual Trump electors. I mean, in terms of the value of their house, the mortgage, etc., or in Europe, where the failure of the Euro project, I mean, translated in inward devaluations, reduction in salaries in Spain, and many other negative things that comes from a poor decision that has been supported by the elites. And therefore, do you think that create the kind of seeds for the current situation?
Who wants to address to that question? Mr. Castañeda, please.
The previous one on
the clash of
question
cultures.
of liberal values. I think there's a very serious problem awaiting us with Trump if he does some of the things he says on issues such as nativism, nationalism, protectionism, a direct onslaught against international organizations like the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, etc. Which is that, unfortunately, I don't like this, but that's the way it is. If the United States does not take a leading role with all its hypocrisy and all its history in being the main standard bearer of these values, they will be weakened in the world. Because the Europeans don't seem to be able to do it. And obviously the Chinese are not going to do it, the Russians are not going to do it, the Latin Americans are not going to do it, so who the hell is going to do it? Without the Americans, I insist, despite all their hypocrisy and the fact that I don't like that things should be this way, without the Americans, who the hell is going to stand up against racism, against anti-Semitism, against anti-misogyny in general, and homophobia? Who's going to do it? That's a great place. Yeah, good for you.
We have some Canadians.
Absolutely.
Will you subscribe that, Mr. Monk?
I'm very skeptical that either Canada or Germany can replace the United States, sadly, nice as those places are. The question was whether or not these are global movements. Look, 2 or 3 years ago, I was starting to study the crisis of liberal democracy and the rise of populism, and I was very worried at a time when many people were not. But I thought, there's one good thing, which is that there's not really a coherent systemic alternative. Countries are not going to start emulating China because it's too much of an ideological mess. It works pretty well in practice, but in theory it doesn't. So it's difficult to import. We're not going to start to copy Iran, not outside of the Muslim world, certainly. You're not going to have theocracies in those countries. And so, Singapore is a nice example. It's a small city-state. So perhaps we're safe. I think now there is a very clear and sadly an increasingly coherent ideological alternative to liberal democracy. It's called illiberal democracy. It has electoral institutions. It has the claim by leaders that they stand for the people, but it's deeply illiberal in two ways. A, it draws its energy from marginalizing, attacking, treating badly ethnic and religious minorities. And two, it claims that I alone stand for the real people. I am your voice, Donald Trump says. And everybody who doesn't agree with me is not a real part of the people. They're not real Americans. It's exactly the same thing in other countries. Today, this morning, I was reading a New York Times article where a pro-government protester was saying, opposition polls, they claim that we're threatening their rights. We're not. They're not even real polls. It's exactly that same idea. And it's striking to what extent that ethno-nationalist energy behind that populism, because populism and ethno-nationalism always go together, are very similar in places that are very dissimilar. So when you think of India, a country which is deeply shaped by Hinduism, you think of Turkey, a country that is deeply shaped by Islam, you think of Russia, a country that is deeply shaped by Orthodox Christianity, you think of Poland, a country that is deeply shaped by Catholicism.
We're running out of time.
They're very, very similar movements. They have this populist energy and they're ethno-nationalist in that sense. And so I think the illiberal international is the real danger over the next years.
Mr. Moratinos,
I want to
clash of
answer
cultures.
the question of our friend
Yeah.
from the audience. Why the elite of the European failed to give the right answer to their people and to create this populism phenomena? I think there are two combined elements. The first, and still I'm insisting, inequality, austerity. You can hide it, you can ignore it, but that is the core issue. And secondly, at the same level, is the lack of political project, the lack of political illusion. 60 years ago, we are going, the Europeans, to celebrate next year the Rome Treaty. Well, Europe was flourishing because we have a project. We have a political positive agenda. Now there is no political positive agenda. Leaders, they are honest and they say, my dear, you are going to have 4, 5, 10 years, even we are on decline. Yesterday panel was that we are on decline. Well, that the people say, well, and that is total disaster. A political man, from my point of view, have to say the truth. But saying the truth have to show the way to get out of the crisis and to engage the people in a positive agenda. And our political leader, with all my respect today, they only are crisis management. We are, well, at the defensive. If you lose the idealistic political agenda, you are lost. If you are always defending yourself because you don't want, you have no project, you have not the capacity to engage with the people. Even asking them to be, economically speaking, austerious, they have to really make, to strengthen the belt, but you have a road. And so what needs European Union now is a political positive agenda. And can be done if we start to work. But we are always playing with...
That's a very, very positive point of view.
So that is my point and my answer.
Thank you. Mr. Martinez, we have 2 more questions here, please.
Good morning. I have an unthinkable, I have an unimaginable for your consideration. Is it possible that we are overemphasizing, over-magnifying populism, and that we're actually not as populist as we think? And I'd like to just give 2 vignettes. In the United States, Barack Obama's approval rating is one of the highest as he leaves office. President-elect Trump did not win the popular election, and his election margin was actually very, very small, less than 100,000 votes in 3 electoral states. The same response with Brexit, slimmest of margins. And so I guess the question that I have for my distinguished fellow panelists, as I am a member of this panel, as I'm a populist, is, are we over-magnifying it through social media? Are we making these gross generalizations without concrete data? And speaking as if there's a new world when half the world is still the old world, so to speak. And so does that then create a new opportunity where we can absolutely reshape this narrative and galvanize that 50% that wasn't with these populists, who actually may be quite smaller. These coalitions of populists are actually small, and sometimes people who identify with the populists are just disagreeing with the mainstream candidate. They themselves do not identify as populists.
Okay.
Thank you. Very long-winded question, but
Yeah,
I would like quick
indeed.
responses for very difficult questions.
Okay, thank you. The next question, please, and then we go over to the panelists.
Populism in the last couple of years, it has a rise as a discomfort of the people from the political business as usual. And in a way, it's seen as an alternative for people to get their views in the mainstream politics, even if later on they might be disappointed or the promises are not met. Seeing that this kind of movement can get a really strong momentum within the population, which kind of alternative do we have to counter that in political terms and make some other forms of politics and government get to the power that actually represent people, capture their views, and deliver in the way to implement them? Thank you.
Okay, so solutions, that was one of the questions, the second one, and the first one was an opportunity maybe for this new world order. Who wants to address these questions? Mr. Castañeda.
Just quickly on the first question.
Yes, please.
I'm not sure we're overstating the numbers for populism, but what is true is that the margins are not enormous, which also means that this is not a lost battle. This is a battle that can be won. It can be won in one country after another after another. In the United States, if there had perhaps been a better Democratic candidate than Hillary Clinton, or if she had carried out a better campaign, or if she had taken stronger stands on issues, she might have won. In the UK, if the Labour Party had been more consistent and said, look, yes, we have problems with Europe, but we're Remainers seriously, and actually went out and campaigned for it. They didn't. And the same will happen in France and in many other countries. So in Latin America and in many other parts of the world, it's the same thing. These are not lost battles. The problem is, where are the solutions? Well, the solutions in those countries where you have clearly had a very significant increase in inequality, and I agree with Moratinos and with Monk on this completely, like the United States or like places in Latin America, you have to reverse those policies. You have to have equalizing policies. If you don't have them, then people will continue to go the other way. If you have countries where unemployment and other issues have made people lose what they had, but you have not had significant increases in inequality, like in Western Europe, you have to adopt other solutions. What you can't have is a situation where, for example, in Mexico, and we can be on the verge of a populist takeover in Mexico, you have people who go out for dinner, not the very, 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 very wealthy, people like ourselves, perhaps with the exception of our colleague here, but like the rest of us. You know, they go out for dinner, and they will spend in one lunch or one dinner, let's say 3 couples, 2 or 3 couples, what a middle-class person makes in 1 month. You can't have that and then expect these people to be happy. They are not going to be happy. But there are things you can do to change that situation, which is why I agree with you. This is not a lost cause at all, but you have to do something to make it a winning cause. If you do nothing, we're going to lose.
Yes, Mr. Matsumi.
I think the inequality is definitely there, but it's economical more than anything else. In the Middle East, all through the history, we had dictatorships. It is packaged into democracy, but it's dictatorship at the end of the day. And there is no change. And people like to put the culture of fear in people in order to make sure to stay in power, because then they can protect you from what's coming. The problem is that, yes, I agree with the argument that it is not a lost hope, but at the end of the day, nothing is being done. And the longer this thing is going to stay, it might turn militant. And we've seen it now in the Middle East with the ISIS ideas and all of this, even though they have a different agenda than the social populist movement. But at the end of the day, it's a solution that people are looking at it as an alternative. So unless we have a very clear policy how we can engage these people to go back to the center, I'm not saying to support, but to move away from this, and the only way we can do it is through proper democratic changes. Otherwise, we're going to get into militant groups. And unfortunately, in the Middle East, there is enough arms flying around that, you can start a third world war at any time.
Okay, I'll take one more question from the audience. Who really has to... Yes, please, the last question. A comment? No, I need a question.
Okay,
question.
The United States doesn't have to be the last man standing. Other countries in the world do have something to contribute, and they would like a chance. And also, these new leaders, the populist leaders of people like Modi and Erdogan, etc., are using their politics to make sure their economics work for a more equal society. And by the way, India is constitutionally secular.
Bravo.
Mr. Monk or Mr. Maksumi, do you want to address the question about...
Yes, I'd love
Putin,
to. This is continuing a conversation we had over dinner on Wednesday, which was quite lively. I'm sad this panel wasn't quite as lively. Look, I think two things. First of all, yes, Mr. Modi... yes, India is a secular country. I think Mr. Modi would like to make it quite a lot less secular, and I think he's made it a lot less pleasant place to live for people who are not Hindu over the last years. And certainly in Turkey there are people who are not Muslim, but I think it's become a much more difficult place there for people to live. It's a more difficult place in Poland for people who are not Catholic to live. So these countries are deeply mono-ethnic. The energy behind these populists is deeply ethnocentric and religiously exclusionary, and that's part of what we have to understand. The other thing I want to say is that in the next 4 or 8 years, the liberal world order is not going to have the backstop that it used to have in the United States for all of its flaws. So countries like India, like Turkey, and so on, are going to start having to think about what they actually want. Because until now they could push against the liberal world order with the United States as a backdrop, knowing that the United States is there to keep core elements of it in place and to provide certain public goods. Now that that is going to be less the case, they have to start actually thinking in a deep way about what they want the world to look like. Do they want to completely abolish the liberal world order, or are there parts of it that are actually in their interests? And I hope that they'll think seriously about it, because if they do, I think they'll realize that there's big parts of this world order in terms of international relations, international institutions, that are actually in their interests. And so I hope that this is a conversation that people in those countries are going to be taking seriously over the next 4 or 8 years, rather than just saying, hurrah, Trump is willing to dismantle all of this order, let's get rid of it and see what happens next.
I'll take one of the questions we got online. Please, Andrew, show me the one about the voters, Trump voters. It was anonymous. Who has actually talked to a voter, a Trump voter? Was that a question? Trump voter, right? Who of the panelists have talked to one of the voters, a Trump voter or a populist voter? Do you?
Well, let's start.
Well,
Just-
Trump voters, unfortunately,
You have to
although
talk to them.
none of my students at NYU are voted for Trump. New York's a strange place. It's really an island, and the rest totally separate from the United States. But I have a lot of friends in New York, actually, who did vote for Trump.
Okay.
And they're rational, perfectly intelligent, well-informed people who are fed up with a system that they don't like. And they're willing to take the risk of, breaking the piñata and see what falls, because they're so fed up with the situation.
There it is.
In Latin America, I had the chance over the years to speak several times, not lengthy, but 15, 20 minutes each time, 10 or 15 times with Hugo Chavez. And it is very disconcerting. Yes, I mean, I know a lot of Venezuelans who are fans of his. I mean, 60, 70% of the people in Venezuela voted for him at the beginning. And it's very confusing, very disconcerting, but they have a point. I mean, you can't say they don't have a point. Just in response to what the friend said, yes, but if somebody doesn't replace the United States, we have a problem. Unfortunately, as much as I have a great deal of affection for Canada and indirectly for India, I don't see that happening. It's not because you're different that you have something to say. I don't see the song that the Canadians or the Indians or the Turks sing. The Americans have had a song to sing for 200 years. They're the most hypocritical of all, but they've had the song. You can't be hypocritical if you don't even have a song. The other guys have no song.
So populist voters do have a point.
Maybe that's why they gave Dylan the Nobel Prize.
Let me go now, Mr. Castañeda and the other panelists, to the closing remarks. I would like to know what do you think is the unthinkable, but not for 2030, as we're talking here in the dialogues, for 2017, for the next years. What is the unthinkable? What are going to be the greatest challenges or the possible conflicts? This is the last round.
You want me to start or what?
Yes, please do so.
Well, the unthinkable is that Trump does what he says.
Very short, please.
That he is reelected in 2020, and that he does what he says for 8 years, and that we have an enormous mess on our hands in the world. In Latin America, in Mexico in particular, and in the United States. That is unthinkable, but unfortunately, it's not impossible.
Wow, okay.
The unthinkable is as far if we don't find a solution for extremism in the Middle East and try to put an end to Daesh and the ISIS, this could spin out of control. So far, it has been in very localized areas. Imagine if this one is going to be spreading into the real Gulf producing oil countries, and that is going to disaster. It will be another 73, what we have seen it before.
Mr. Moratinos?
I will say first unthinkable, then a very short general comment. The unthinkable and a positive one is to have a real credible UN that could gather the reform and then bring peace to the whole world and ESDG agenda. That is unthinkable that we will think about that. But general comment that this conference was on the change of mind. Well, we are in 2016. The world have changed. And unfortunately, we don't want to realize that we have to be adapted to the new world. So some analysts have even said that Trump's election, it has not been a Republican, it has been a change of regime. I remember that the U.S. was always concerned about regime change, but regime change maybe has happened in the United States. It's the first start that we have to take into account. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that we, the government, the political government, have to be totally changed. We have to introduce, like the French Revolution, it was bourgeoisie has entered in the system. We have to enter with civil society, with the private sector, with media, but with a responsible way. We have to prepare to new democratic system that have to be built in order to prepare the future of our ourselves.
A really big challenge, Mr. Mong.
I think the unthinkable is happening, which is that we now have to fight for the survival of liberal democracy in the United States and around the world. We're going to spend, I think, the next 30 or 40 years in that battle. I don't think it's just about Donald Trump. I don't think it's just about the next 4 years. This is a movement, this is an energy that is going to be with our politics for a long time. The unthinkable is that we will lose it, that we are simply fighting windmills, to quote a Spanish author. That we are basically on the losing end of history here. I know that for myself that I'm happy to fight the fight no matter the outcome, that this is something to which I'm committed, and if it happens that we are history's tragic heroes who are fighting for the survival of certain values which cannot be saved in the world, then so be it. But I also agree that we can win this fight, and that if we change how we govern, if we make clear what values are at stake, and if we're courageous, then we can create a better world. But the stakes are now much, much higher than we realized a couple of years ago.
Fighting against windmills. I hope we all are prepared for that for the next years. Thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for participating. And let me introduce Nick Going, who is going to moderate this last session. Nick.
I'm not going to moderate anything before everyone leaves. This is just 2 minutes to remind you of what we're going to do at the end. What is the state of your mental map 48 hours on?
Thank you.
We want to see the final session not as a closing session, but as a takeoff session. And what I'm going to say is now about how there's been a certain generation on the panel, or on all the panels in the last 48 hours. There's going to be the next generation, the emerging leaders, many of you, 4 of them who've elected them, they've been elected by the other emerging leaders, will be up here on the platform. But we also want to have a brainstorming. Those unthinkables we've just been hearing about, the unthinkable of what might happen next and what is going to happen next. If you arrived feeling relatively optimistic, you might at least feel a little more realistic. So please stick around for the 1 o'clock session. Don't head off to the Medina and delay your trip to pick up your flight just a little bit to make sure you're still